Hi, welcome to this What's New technical update presentation on IBM Spectrum Protect version 8.17 and IBM Spectrum Protect Plus 10.13. My name is Trisha Jiang, and I'm going to be walking you through the new features in IBM Spectrum Protect, HSM for Windows, HSM for Unix, Spectrum Protect for virtual environments, and Spectrum Protect snapshots, as well as Spectrum Protect for mail. Version 8.17 and 10.13 announced on February 12, 2019, and G8 on February 22, 2019. After I finish going through the information on these functions, I'll turn it over to my colleague Sean Sperry to go through what's new in Spectrum Protect Plus 10.13. The first function I'm going to talk about is retention sets, also known as OneProtect. This new feature allows you to take existing backups and create a snapshot of them and keep that snapshot for a specific amount of time. The great thing about this is it's single ingest. That data is already backed up. You don't have to re-back it up. And we're basically just taking a virtual point-in-time snapshot of that already backed up data. Now that data could be Spectrum Protect backup data from the Backup Archive client. It could be Spectrum Protect for VE backup data or system state backups. And the data that we're using to create these snapshots can reside in any of our storage pools or containers. It doesn't matter if once we create this snapshot, if that backed up data is tiered or migrated or moved, we'll be tracking the retention sets regardless of where the data resides inside of Spectrum Protect. Now, for this version, the data is not copied. We're using the existing data wherever it resides inside of Spectrum Protect. All we're doing is updating the meta information so that we can track that retention set. Now, retention sets can be retained from anywhere from 1 day to 82 years, and we are tracking these independently of the backup data retention period. Because as you know, backups are based upon versions inside of Spectrum Protect. So even if the backup data is set to expire off, we won't remove it from Spectrum Protect until the retention set period is reached. So everything is data lifecycle managed, it is policy based, and it is automated when scheduled for the creation of these retention sets. You can keep the data based on weekly, monthly, quarterly, or yearly timeframes, and that could be for 1 month, 2 months, 3 years, whatever you need. I do have a YouTube out there on creating these, so do check that out. That'll give you a good visual on how to do this. Another nice thing about retention sets is special pricing. So once the data is no longer being retained as a backup, but now we're just retaining it for retention sets, we will then track that data at a different price point if you are using the Spectrum Protect Suite archive option. And we do have a BE capacity counting script which will go through and check to see when this data is turned from backup versions into only being retained for retention sets. And that runs basically on a weekly basis that you would see those numbers update in your licensing. Okay, let's take a deeper look at retention sets. The first thing about retention sets is what's called retention rule. And a retention rule is a template that defines what is going to be included in the retention set, so which nodes or file spaces, when that retention set should be created, and for how long the data inside the retention set should be retained. A retention set itself is basically that virtual point-in-time snapshot. It can consist of nodes or file spaces and can have different nodes and multiple file spaces inside of one retention set. And of course, it is set to be kept for a certain amount of time. In 8.17, we only support in place or inventory only snapshots, which means we are not making additional copies of the already backed up data, nor do you have to re-back up that data. We're simply taking what's already in our storage pool inventory and we're updating our server metadata inventory with a note that these files are now being retained as a retention set. cannot add nodes to retention rules if they're being replicated to a down-level Spectrum Protect server, and nodes that are members of a retention rule or set cannot be replicated if that target server is also down-level. So 2 things to take note of. Inside of Spectrum Protect, when we have backup data, that backup data is either active, meaning it's the most recent version of a backup data, or it's inactive, meaning there's a newer version of that same file. We now have a retained state. So once the data has expired off as backups, we will turn that state to retained. So state changes to retained if a file would have expired based on policy in its copy group, meaning its backup copy group. And now retained files, they'll still reside in their respective storage pools. However, we're going to keep them there as long as required for that retention set. A couple things to note. If you do try and run like a delete backup, or you try and remove a node that has file sets associated with it, it will look like that function succeeded, but the backups in the retention sets will not be deleted until the retention set time is up. You can query retention sets. You can update either the retention period or the description of a retention set. And you can manually delete a retention set prior to its original retention period. Retention sets are based on when that snapshot was actually taken, not when the retention rule was created, but when the snapshot was actually taken. We do have the ability to create one-time snapshots. These can also be created to run in the past. If you do choose to create a one-time snapshot in the past, we will pick up the files that were active at that point in time. However, if we have already expired off any of those files, we won't obviously include them in the retention set, and we won't throw up any errors saying that they were not included. Okay, data in a retention set can be replicated, and that replicated data can be retained. So basically, we're just replicating the backed up data. However, we don't replicate retention rules or retention sets, just the data itself. And when you create a retention set, you can either create it on the target or on the primary server, but not on both. And the way that we asynchronously run the replication, usually after the backups are done and after replication sets have been created, we'll go ahead and we'll let you create a retention set, but when we try and run replication and notice that, gee, you already have the same thing on the other server, that's when we'll throw up an error. And you will see these types of ANR 2377E errors being shown, and we won't allow replication to continue until you delete the retention set on either the primary or target server. You'll have to choose. Another thing to take into consideration, if you are creating retention sets and your replication is set to have either similar or dissimilar policies, how we treat the data. If it's a similar policy on both the Spectrum Protect target and primary server, then if the retention set is created on the source and then replicated over the target server, the data on the target will not expire until all the retention sets containing that data expire and all the data is removed from the source. If the files in a retention set is created on the target server, then the data will be retained on the target per retention policy, regardless of when it expires on the source. And after the source data expires, the retained data on the source server is no longer considered to be replicated, and when one retention set gets expired on the target server, it will delete all the retained objects attached to it only. Now, replication when dissimilar policies, meaning that you have a longer retention period on the Spectrum Protect target server, are in effect, then if a file is in a retention set created on the source server, expiration on the target server will decide how many versions of replica objects to keep and for how long to keep each version. If a file is in a retention set created on the target server, then it basically acts like a single server without replication. Expiration on the target server decides when to delete the backup versions, and if it belongs to an active retention set, it'll be kept as retained until the expiration of that retention set. So the summary of this is, yes, we replicate the data underneath the retention set. You can only create retention sets on either the primary or the target server for that specific node's data. And when you replicate, just be aware if you have dissimilar policies in place. The Operations Center is the easiest place to set up retention rules and take a look at retention sets. When we create the retention set, if you go into Services and Retention Rules, you can click on plus Create Rule, and that will create a new rule. We also have the ability to copy an existing rule. So if you were to select an existing rule and click on this plus Create Rule From, you could create a similar rule. Maybe you change something like the nodes that were in that group, or maybe the retention period or whatever. But that's an easy way to create a similar rule. You can also do a creation of a one-time retention set if you don't want to have it scheduled to repeat. And that can either be by going into Retention Rules and clicking on plus Create Retention Set, which would be for an existing rule, or going into the nodes, the client screen, and clicking on the right button and then More, and then Create Retention Set from there. And that would be a one-time retention set. You can view, update, or delete retention sets by going into Retention Sets and then clicking the Delete or Update or Modify command. And you can modify things like the properties inside of it or how long the data is being retained. Do check out my YouTube video. I go through and show you how simple it is to set up, and I show you the different screens that are involved inside of the Operations Center. Now, the Operations Center cannot create retention rules to protect nodes on a target server if the nodes were replicated over, and in that case, you'd have to use the command line. But the Operations Center would not display the results of that retention set. In version 8.1.7, we're introducing a new concept called a job. And a job is able to identify which activity log records go with an individual process. And we're introducing this for retention set creation in 8.1.7. And basically what you'll see when you look at these jobs is you'll see all the different threads, processes, and sessions that are involved with the boss job. Now, this could actually be over many days, weeks, or years that these messages will be associated with an individual job. So if you did a query job, you'll see the different jobs that are out there. And then if you did a query act log with a specific job number, that will give you all the messages over a specific amount of time. So in this case, we did today minus 30, so up to 30 days ago. And then in this case, all of these were associated with a retention set that failed. This is going to be a great way to identify which activity logs go with a specific process. We do have some new command line commands for the retention set, and I've outlined those here. Everything from the define ret rule, so define retention rule, updates, renames, queries, or deletes those retention rules. And then for the retention sets, you can query and update and delete those as well. You can also query the retention set contents if you want to see specifically what is inside of a retention set. In summary, retention sets take backup data and turn it into a point-in-time snapshot that's going to be retained for a specific amount of time without having to be backed up again. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to ServerMon. ServerMon is an automatic collection piece that's running in the background that's collecting things like debug information, configuration, health environment, all that can be used to help IBM support resolve any issues that you hit. Now, this is going to continuously collect the material in the background. It is negligible performance hits, so you don't have to worry about it impacting your performance. And if the server does actually encounter a problem, then the customer can go into ServerMon, extract the archived information, and send it to the support folks. This collection is going to create a new ServerMon directory, which is basically a staging area. And then it's going to take the data that's staged to that area and compress it and consolidate it into a zip file, which is then put into the ServerMon_archives table in the Spectrum Protect database. Now these zip files will automatically be pruned out of the database, and that's based upon the daily retention, which by default is 90 days, and then the weekly snapshot will be kept up to a default of 30 weeks. If you did want to manually do anything with ServerMon, the command is servermon. You can also issue servermon-debug. You can run servermon-list to list which archives are actually in your database. If you wanted to manually remove an archive, you could do that with the -remove. And if support asks you, you could extract an archive with the extract command. I do have a YouTube out there so you can see this in action. I show you how to run some of these ServerMon commands, as well as we look at what information is being stored inside of the archives. Another new option inside the Spectrum Protect server is remove STG protection. In previous versions, if you had a container storage pool, a directory container storage pool, that was replicated, and for some reason that replication pair got damaged, either to a deletion of the source or target server, or loss of the partner server due to a disaster, or some type of repurposing where you didn't clean up before you repurposed that Spectrum Protect server, that retention data could be hanging out on the target server with no way of being expired. Previously, you could run this protect storage pool command, and this worked, but it was slow because the primary server had to open a lot of sessions and send over information across the network to the target server, and there were a lot of large data sets and all involved. In version 8.17, we have a new command, remove STG protection. This can be used to remove or preview the removal of unwanted replicated data, should any of those conditions happen. This will remove the data, so use this command with caution. I've listed the command here. I do recommend you check out more information in the knowledge documentation before utilizing it. Okay, next we're going to look at the new object agents, and the importance of the object agents is we are now able to utilize Spectrum Protect as an S3 interface, and currently that S3 interface is only collecting information from Spectrum Protect Plus, but maybe in the future we'll open it up to other S3 applications also. And by having the Spectrum Protect server create an object agent, we can now offload the Spectrum Protect data into Spectrum Protect and keep it for long-term retention. We are actually on the Spectrum Protect server creating a new storage area, which is an object storage, which you can run things like gets and posts and puts and deletes against. And this is how Spectrum Protect Plus will be communicating with Spectrum Protect. We currently support the object agent running on Linux and Windows Spectrum Protect server natively. And if you do have an AIX Spectrum Protect server, you can run the object agent offboard on a Linux machine. Now, the easiest way to set up this object agent is via the Operations Center. I do have YouTubes out there showing the setup of these object agents as well as the interaction with the Spectrum Protect Plus offload. So do check those out. So the first step of setting up an object agent on your Spectrum Protect server is to configure an object agent. You can have one object agent per Spectrum Protect server. Of course, you can do this from the command line with the defined server object agent equals yes command, but it's a lot easier to go into the Operations Center. And if you go under servers, details, object agent, add, or you can go into clients plus client object agent, you'll basically be prompted for the name of the object agent you want to create. And we recommend you call this the same as your Spectrum Protect server name. You can use the port 9000 by default, but if you want to change that, you can as well. Once you enter these two pieces, you will get an endpoint address, which will be important when you're defining the Spectrum Protect offload to work with this object agent. And you'll be given some commands you need to run on the Spectrum Protect server. And these commands basically will start the object agent as well as start the object agent services on the Windows or Linux machines. If it is an AIX Spectrum Protect server, then you will set this up as an off-boarded service on a Linux machine, and I just recommend you check out the directions in the documentation for Spectrum Protect. After you've set up an object agent, you can set up one or more object client. You can do this with the command line with the registered node command, type equals object client, but I always recommend using the Operations Center, where if you go into clients plus client and then object client, you'll be prompted for the correct entries for an object client. Now I recommend you name that client the same name as the Spectrum Protect Plus server you're going to be offloading from. That'll make it easy to identify. Thus, if you're offloading from multiple Spectrum Protect Plus servers, you'll have one object client for each of your Spectrum Protect Plus servers. You can enable the replication of the data that's being offloaded. Just one thing to note is that when you do a restore from Spectrum Protect Plus, it can only see the files on the primary Spectrum Protect server. You will be prompted for a policy to go with this S3 object agent, and a couple things to note. The domain that the node is being assigned to has to have a backup copy group, but it doesn't require an archive copy group because all of the offloaded data will be treated as backup objects. We only support either directory or cloud container pools, and all of the objects that are written to this S3 pool are going to be uniquely named. There is never going to be any inactive versions of those objects, so you can set your versions data exist to 1. And because there's never any inactive objects, the retain extra and retain only setting can be set to 0 days. Now, the Spectrum Protect server doesn't control the object deletion of these objects inside of this S3 pool, and that deletion is done by the Spectrum Protect Plus server, so you do need to make sure that the object client node allows backup deletion, and the Operations Center will set up the object client node to have that parameter set. So after you've entered the information in the Operations Center, you'll get a screen like this here, which gives you the access key ID, the secret access key, the endpoint, and the agent certificate. And all of this should kind of look familiar. This is kind of the same thing you'll see when you're utilizing other S3 pools like out in the cloud. And all of this is going to be critical when you're defining this object node to the Spectrum Protect Plus server. So you'll want to keep this screen up while you're doing the definition in Spectrum Protect Plus. If you for some reason lose this information or close out the screen or it becomes compromised, you can generate a new secret key from the client's property pages, and you'll see that here where you can regenerate the credentials. Other things you can do with the object agent on our Operations Center dashboard, you'll now see us reporting on the object agent status. You can also go into activity, into object agents, and see the recent activity of those object agents. Inside of the alert pages, we trigger alerts on the object agents. Under schedules, you'll see any scheduled operations, as well as this set at risk parameter, which is going to impact how our ring looks here. You can choose if you want your object client to show up at risk if it hasn't backed up in the last 6 hours, the last day, last 10 weeks, whatever you choose in there, you can set that globally with this parameter. We also report on the object agents when you create an operational report. So do check out my videos where I walk you through setting up these object agents, and I also walk you through setting up the object clients and setting up the offload from a Spectrum Protect Plus server. The next new feature is a reintroduction of a secure web client that allows you to do file level recovery. Back in version 8.1.2, we took the backup archive web client and removed it because of security reasons. So in this 8.1.7, we're reintroducing it, and it now is secure. So we're using secure protocols when it communicates with the different clients in the Spectrum Protect servers. And this is going to allow the help desk operators to perform file restore operations on behalf of end users from a remote GUI. So you physically don't have to be at the end user's box to do the restores for them. Currently, this GUI is restore only, and it's supported on Windows, Linux, x86, 64 machines where the backup archive client is running. Now, the user interface will run in Chrome, Firefox, and Edge, and when you access that user interface, you'll use this basic protocol of https://hostname, the port, which by default is 9081 /BA GUI /. And it works with Spectrum Protect server versions 8.1.2 or higher, or version 7.1.8 or higher. Some of the currency upgrades for the servers and clients: we now support IBM TS1160 tape drives. The Operations Center has added client update push for the Ubuntu Debian package. And Spectrum Protect Exchange now supports Exchange 2019. The Spectrum Protect client, we are using the IBM_JRE, and that's used for starting and stopping the Liberty web server that's used for that Spectrum Protect client. The client web server is not installed by default, so if you do want to install that, it has to be selected by the user during the install. Some of the other third-party component levels we're upgrading: GRE version is now 8.05.25, GSKit version is 8.055.2, SIT version is 2.8.0.8000, and our Liberty web servers 18.0.0.4. One thing to note about the Liberty web server is they no longer support installing just a base version. You now have to install the full version, so you will see the Liberty web server taking up additional space when it does the install. Okay, let's switch over to our space management products. On HSM for Windows, we've done a recall update. Now when users or applications start recalling a file, they'll be able to immediately access that content even before the entire content is recalled. So for example, if you're doing a copy process of a recalled file, that copy process will start immediately, even before the entire file has been recalled. The user will see on the client side a progress bar on how much data has been recalled. Now, one thing to note is that some applications will not start displaying the file or allow copy operations until the file is completely restored. This is especially notable in Windows media servers, and this has to do with how the media players expect an end-of-file marker before they will start streaming the content. Another thing is that a remote recall of a very large file will start transferring immediately, so it won't wait until you won't get customers getting frustrated and timing that out or canceling it. Okay, HSM and Unix. Some of the new options here: the HSM client is providing the option to configure the RPC port that's used for the recall daemon. And so this allows the customer to ensure that only those specific ports are being opened, and it can close the firewall around any other ports. Check out the Knowledge Center for information on that. The HSM client is also providing new configuration options to configure the recall for performance improvements, and this includes HSM recall buffer size and HSM recall buffer alignment. Also check out the Knowledge Center for more detail on those. Snapshot for Windows. We are now supporting Windows and Exchange 2019, as well as Mailbox Restore browser for the Exchange 2016 and Exchange 2019. We still support Exchange 2013, but the MAPI CDO package is required, and Mailbox Restore can be used on local machines with that Exchange server. And the Mailbox Restore supports non-Unicode PST files. For Exchange 2016 and Exchange 2019, we have 32-bit Outlook 2016 or later version that's required, and the MRB support can be used from a separate Outlook machine, and MRB supports Unicode PST files. Okay, also note that Windows 2019 requires the new versions of XIV and SVC providers. For Spectrum Protect for VE, some of the currency updates there. For VMware images, the SSL certificate securities are now being accepted automatically for enhanced security. We now offer improved problem determination in the plugin, so you'll get better error codes that'll give you more detailed information on VM backup and restore problems. The Delete Data Mover, if you do delete a data mover plugin, it's going to remove all of the unneeded config files and services. And file level restores in domain trusts have been tested and are supported. Spectrum Protect for VE for hypervisor. We have full parallelism for backup and restores, which is similar to what we've supported previously in VMware, and we've added some additional parameters to that. We also have instant access restores for virtual machines, just like we had in VMware, and this is going to be useful if you're looking to verify the integrity of a Hyper-V VMware backup without having to restore that data. You can access it directly from its backup location. We also have some enhanced error reporting in the MMC and PowerShell, and that gives additional information on tasks and diagnostics. Okay, with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sean. He is going to walk you through the new enhancements in Spectrum Protect Plus version 10.1.3.
Hello, my name is Sean Sperry, and I am going to present the updates for Spectrum Protect Plus version 10.1.3. So this presentation is going to include the new information and changes in this version of the product, which was released in February of 2019. Now, I do want to let you know that this is only the differences in Spectrum Protect version 10.1.3. So if you're interested in all of the features of the product, I would encourage you to go out there and Google. We have a lot of demos available on YouTube with information about how the product works and the features and functions. But let's get started with just the 10.1.3 differences. Beginning at version 10.1.3, we introduced optimized S3 offloads to both object storage and the Spectrum Protect server, and we're going to cover that in detail coming up in the upcoming slides. We introduced support for protecting and data reuse of MongoDB. We introduced support for Microsoft Exchange in the application, so we're supporting two new applications, MongoDB and Exchange. And we'd made a significant number of small usability enhancements to the GUI, to the infrastructure, and to the reporting and to the APIs. So I want to go over all of those and as we go through the slides. So let's start with the optimized offload to the cloud and Spectrum Protect. In Spectrum Protect Plus, you have the ability to store data to a vSnap repository, as you can see in the picture at the bottom. And generally speaking, the intention of the developers is for you to store your operational data and needs for operational recovery and data reuse in vSnap. But a lot of people also have a need to offload data to perhaps some cheaper kind of storage or less expensive kind of storage for long-term data retention. And that is why, beginning in version 10.1.3, we introduced the ability to use S3 to offload to longer term storage, either in the cloud or to Spectrum Protect. Now, the storage repositories that we're going to support are IBM Cloud Object Storage, either on-premise or off-premise, IBM Cloud Object Storage retention vaults or worm technology for data retention needs where you can't change the data, Amazon S3, AWS S3 storage, Microsoft Azure Blob storage, or the offload to Spectrum Protect for you to store your long-term data in Spectrum Protect. And we're going to kind of look at those, each one of those in detail, and look at the details of how that's done and how that's supported. First, starting with object storage, we can offload to either on-premises IBM Cloud Object Storage or IBM Cloud Object Storage Worm, and this is one of the advantages of IBM Cloud Object Storage. It can be deployed as an appliance in your data center if you'd like to store data there at a very economical cost. And we also support, if you want to use a cloud provider to host this, offloading data to IBM Cloud Object Storage, IBM Cloud Object Storage Worm, and also Amazon S3 or AWS and Microsoft Azure Blob storage. Now, we do support the ability to offload from either the primary or the vSnap copy of the data, depending on the network connection. One might be preferred over another. And we are going to do incremental forever offloads. So the first offload of the data is going to be a full, and thereafter we're only going to move the changes to the cloud. Now, this retention is going to be fully maintained from Spectrum Protect Plus. So as you probably know, Spectrum Protect Plus is an SLA-driven product. And when you set up the SLA in Spectrum Protect Plus, what you'll be able to do is control the retention of this offloaded data. The data will be instantly mountable from the offloaded copy, however. So if you need to do a restore from the cloud or from Spectrum Protect, you'll be able to mount that data and either use it for data reuse in a test or clone scenario, or also restore the data back to a production environment. We did have some restrictions previously on the Spectrum Protect Plus workloads that were supported, specifically with regard to offloading to Spectrum Protect. And those restrictions have all been lifted at version 10.1.3. So now we support offloading all of the types of data that are supported by Spectrum Protect Plus, including VMware, Hyper-V, Oracle, SQL Server, Exchange, MongoDB, and all of the workloads. So now we're going to dig into the technical details of the offload and how it works. So I'd like to start off with some terminology about the offload. We're going to use an offload pool to do the offload, which is a logical file system pool that lives on the vSnap server, to which the data blocks will be sent during an offload. And we also use a VBD, or a virtual block device, and that is going to be the virtualized physical disk representation of the storage, pointing to the object storage in the cloud. Finally, there's a couple files that are used to manage the offload. First, there's this block map file, which is the metadata for identifying the change blocks within the snapshots that allows us to do the incremental offloads. And also this manifest file, which is the metadata file used for storing records of all the offloaded operations. Okay, so here's the big picture of the offloaded process. First of all, for the first offload, a snapshot is going to be backed up in full. And as I mentioned a little earlier, subsequent offloads are going to be incremental and only capture the cumulative changes since the last offload. Now, when an offload is completed, Metadata is going to be written to a block map file, which is going to be stored in the cloud. And we're also going to maintain this manifest file, which contains the records for each offloaded vSnap volume. And that, for safety's sake, is also going to be offloaded in the cloud so that you have it in the event of disaster recovery or you lose your vSnap server. A VVD, or virtual block device, is going to be created using all the available block map files and used to map the changed blocks and organize them into objects to be sent to the cloud resources. Now, the way incremental offload works is a little different than the way vSnap replication works. With vSnap replication, if you miss a particular day or several days, all the snapshots are going to be sent to the replication partner that occurred in between the days that you did the replication. So for instance, if you replicated Friday after replicating on Monday and you backed up every day, Tuesday through Friday would be sent to the replication partner. For offload, we're only going to capture the latest snapshot on the vSnap. And what this is useful for doing is if you want to maybe have different offload schedules than replication schedules. So for example, you might want to offload to the cloud only once a week or once a month, but maintain the replication on a daily basis, or maintain every copy in the replication. And having that offload capture the latest snapshot from vSnap is very useful for achieving that. Again, the VBD, or virtual block device, is going to be used to map the changed blocks and organize them into objects to be sent up to the cloud. And of course, the metadata is also captured and sent to the cloud for purposes of disaster recovery. Now, the opposite of sending the data to the cloud is going to be a restore. And when a restore runs, a VBD is going to be created using all of the block map files starting with the base up to the snapshot being restored. That offload pool is then imported into the vSnap, and the restore can proceed as if the entire snapshot is available locally. The reads of the actual data, however, are going to be satisfied by the data that is stored in the cloud provider or Spectrum Protect. Now, for performance reasons, we store the last three offloads metadata in the original vSnap, and what that allows us to do is improve the performance of pulling the metadata back from the cloud. We also do some other things to improve performance, restore performance. We prefetch extra blocks from the cloud because you typically get the set of docs that exist in the same cloud object together, so that's going to improve some performance. And we're also going to periodically merge the block maps to update the base copy in the cloud. Now, the last thing we need to talk about from a conceptual perspective is expiration of cloud objects. And as the snapshots in the vSnap repository expire and are deleted based on the retention that you set, the blocks that are specific to those snapshots are no longer needed for restore, and they can be deleted from the cloud objects. Since the cloud objects contain random device blocks, it may not be possible to delete the unneeded blocks immediately, and they will need to be retained until all of the blocks within an object are no longer needed. When all the blocks in a given cloud object are expired, then the cloud object is going to be deleted. Okay, so just a special Note about retention enable vaults for IBM Cloud Object Storage. IBM Cloud Object Storage does support worm or retention enable vaults, and we do support offloading to those, and the cloud servers with worm devices will have offload retention options disabled. So the worm status is going to be detected when the worm cloud server is registered, and the data will be retained on this device indefinitely. Okay, some notes about registering. As I mentioned, registering the cloud provider. We support Azure, AWS, IBM Cloud Object Server, and the Spectrum Protect repository server. For Azure, we're going to support Azure Hot-to-Cool Azure storage accounts or blobs. For AWS, we're going to support the S3 standard tier, S3 intelligent tiering tier, S3 standard infrequent access tier, and S3 one zone infrequent access tier. But you will have to create the bucket where these where this data is stored in advance. For IBM Cloud Object Storage, again, you will have to create the bucket where the data is stored. And a little bit further in this presentation, we're going to talk about Spectrum Protect as a repository server. But in summary, you do need to set up the object agent and the object client, and we're going to talk about that coming up in some slides if you're using Spectrum Protect. Now, one note I want to point out here, if you go to this tech note, this 108.69560, I didn't really want to include all the details of that documentation, but there's some very good information in there about each one of these cloud providers and the detailed steps necessary to set things up on the cloud side. So I would recommend you take a look at this tech note if you're setting this up to help you get your bearings inside Azure, AWS, IBM Cloud Object Storage, etc. Just taking a quick look at the GUI. Here you see the left-hand menu or the navigation menu on Spectrum Protect Plus, and the way you register a new cloud is under System Configuration, Backup Storage. This disk down here is how you set up vSnap repositories, and here is where you set up cloud repositories, and you just do an add cloud. You're just going to fill in the detail for each one of the cloud providers. So you pick your provider type, you'll give it a name, you'll give it an endpoint, so where you're storing the data using the REST API, key name, access key, and secret key. So these are the credentials that you're using to access the object storage. In some cases, you're going to require a certificate, in which case you can set this up here. And then finally, you're going to create, and that will create the cloud repository. Now, once you create the cloud repository, you'll then click this Get Buckets button, and it will pull back all the buckets or vaults in the case of COS. That will let you choose the particular bucket that you've pre-created to store the data on. So once you set up the object storage, this is the same old SLA policy that you're used to seeing from Spectrum Protect 10.1.2, and we now have this section called Operational Protection, which is where you set up your replication and your main policy. And we've now added a new long-term additional protection to the SLA. And you can select this offload to object storage. You can use the main policy destination or the replication policy destination to send the data from. and then send the data either to cloud servers and pick the one that you defined earlier, or to a repository server and send it to Spectrum Protect. Okay, so continuing with the S3 offload, uh, pretty much almost everything we said that applies to offloading to the cloud also applies to offloading to Spectrum Protect. Beginning in version 8.1.7, we support using S3 from Spectrum Protect Plus to offload to Spectrum Protect. Now, in this initial version, we're going to support the container pool types, including a directory pool and a object pool. But at this current version 10.1.3, we do not support offloading directly to a legacy pool, which is what is used for tape. So tape is not going to be supported in this initial release. Now, for those of you who've been following Spectrum Protect Plus, you know that we always offloaded to Spectrum Protect, but we used Spectrum Protect for VE to do it. And what we found is that was a little complicated to implement, first of all, and then second of all, it only supported VMware workloads. So what we've done with moving in this new direction with this S3 offload is now to support offload in a more optimized way that's going to be easier to implement and also support all of the various different types of Spectrum Protect Plus workloads. So now there are no restrictions in terms of the workloads you can offload, including Hyper-V, VMware, SQL Server, Exchange, Oracle, DB2, and MongoDB, and whatever other applications I'm assuming we choose to add in the future. As I mentioned, we currently support offloading to directory or cloud container pools. You can protect those if you want using tape, but from a direct offload perspective, we do not support directly offloading to legacy device classes or tape directly. Same as offloading to the cloud, you'll be able to do things from the primary or the replicated vSnap copy, and we're also going to do incremental forever. So the first offload will be a full, everything thereafter will be only the changes. Another change that is going to occur from version 10.1.2 to 10.1.3 is it used to be in earlier versions of offload that the policy on the Spectrum Protect side managed the retention of the offloaded data. Beginning in Spectrum Protect Plus version 10.1.3, we now manage the retention of that from Spectrum Protect Plus. So you no longer have to set that up in Spectrum Protect. And just like with the cloud, we also have the instantly mountable copies available from the offloaded backup. Now, my colleague Trisha Zhang, in her 8.1.7 lecture, gave you some information about the object agent and how to set things up. Just for the purposes of having everything in one place, I do have some information here on how to set that up with Spectrum Protect Plus. But I would encourage you to watch the lecture that she did to get some of that information. And I would also encourage you to use the Operation Center to do a lot of this. It's all wizard driven, and I mean, obviously you can do things from the command line if you want to, but it's a lot easier to do from the Operation Center, and it just guides you through all of these various steps. So basically you just create the object agent, you create the client for the object agent, and then finally you go in and set up the Spectrum Protect Plus side with the name, host name, port, key name, access key, secret key, and certificate. So basically you're just pointing to the Spectrum Protect server. When you do that, the Spectrum Protect server is going to be added as a repository, and you can enable offload using the SLA policies that we looked at a bit earlier. So you're just going to go into those SLAs and change them to do the additional protection, and then it will run according to the policy in the SLA. Restoring from the cloud or a repository server, meaning Spectrum Protect, are basically the same operation. All the recovery points for backups offloaded to the cloud or repository server can be recovered from Spectrum Protect Plus. For VM and application restores, the recovery points are visible via the restore list by restore by cloud or repository server. So basically you can go in here and just pick repository server or cloud. The offloads are going to be instantly mountable copies, so they're the same as if they were stored in the vSnap. But there are a couple exceptions to the granularity that you can get from the cloud or from Spectrum Protect. First, at 10.1.3, we don't support file level restore directly from the cloud or Spectrum Protect, although you can download that VM and mount it over and copy over the files, of course. And we also don't support point-in-time database restores from offloaded copies in version 10.1.3. We do support, however, some of the various different options that are available with a restore. So you can choose an alternate vSnap, for instance, if you want to improve the communication and networking. And you can also change the desired type of restore. So for instance, if you wanted to do a test restore and just copy a pointer of the data and leave the data in the cloud, you can do that. So those options are indeed supported. Okay, so that's S3 offload to Spectrum Protect and the cloud providers. Next, we're going to move on to Spectrum Protect Plus 10.1.3 and MongoDB application support. So before we get into the details of MongoDB and how Spectrum Protect Plus protects it, for me personally, MongoDB was one of those databases that is new. It's a more modern database, and I wanted to provide just a briefest overview of MongoDB and what it's all about so we can talk about the data protection aspects of it. MongoDB is a JSON documented oriented database. It's one of the newer databases, at least as far as I'm concerned, on the market. And it's one of the so-called NoSQL databases. And the reason for that is each item is going to be stored in the server as a JSON document when you're storing things. Now, the server is going to contain several databases, just like some of the other databases. The defaults are going to be local, admin, and config. And then it's going to contain one or more collections, which are going to be where the JSON documents are stored. Now, queries, as opposed to using SQL, when you do the queries, are done in JSON. So there's an example of what a query looks like in MongoDB. Now, a lot of MongoDBs are very large from what I understand, and because of that, MongoDB is going to support a lot of solutions for clustering and replicas. So in terms of support, it's going to support replica sets, which allows you to replicate the same set of data across multiple servers, and sharded clusters, which distributes the data across multiple replica sets. Now, I just want to mention, in our initial release of MongoDB support for Spectrum Protect Plus, we are going to support replica sets, but we won't be supporting sharded clusters in this initial release. some of the reasons a user might want to use MongoDB is low setup cost, highly flexible document storage, data redundancy, and the open source tooling and ecosystem for the product. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of MongoDBs are deployed in so-called replica sets, and a replica set is going to be a highly available MongoDB. So with a replica set, there's going to be one primary nodes where all the writes are written to, and there's up to 50 secondary nodes. And what happens with the secondaries is the primary replicates the data to the secondaries, but of course, just like any of these other replica technologies, there may be some delay in the replication due to the speed of the internet or the speed of the network, etc. So from a backup perspective, the optimal node for backup for MongoDB is the so-called hidden secondary node. And for Spectrum Protect Plus, that is where we're going to try to do the backup if you do back up a MongoDB replica set. Now, what's going to happen when you have a replica set in Spectrum Protect Plus for a MongoDB, it's going to appear in the GUI as a single instance instead of one instance per node. And Spectrum Protect Plus is going to choose the appropriate node for backup based on the discovery that it does of the inventory that it does on the database. Here are some information about how it picks the node for backup. I won't read all of that to you, but suffice it to say that you only need to back up from a single node, and that node is going to be the hidden secondary first. Now, from a supported platforms perspective, we're going to support MongoDB on version 3.6 and later, and 4.0 and later. And the operating systems that we are going to support MongoDB running on as of today are Linux x86 64-bit. Now, MongoDB does run on other platforms. We're considering supporting those other platforms in the future, but as of this 10.1.3 delivery, those are the operating systems that we are supporting data protection on. We always recommend that you install the latest patches and updates, and we are going to support, as I mentioned, both the standalone instance and a replica set. We do allow MongoDB to use the so-called wired tiger or mmap storage engine, and we do require that your MongoDB be run over LVM2 as a volume manager for Linux. And again, that's the same requirement as we have for DB2. From a permission perspective, the user in the MongoDB must be able to retrieve the server info and status from the MongoDB admin database. On this screen, you see some of the prerequisite software that is required to be installed on the system for MongoDB, and also the ports that are required for connectivity. I won't read the details to you on that. I would encourage you to take a look at that after the lecture if you're interested in MongoDB. And then also the authentication and privileges that are required. These are very similar to DB2. So if you've implemented Spectrum Protect Plus for DB2, you already know that the Spectrum Protect Plus user has to have passwordless sudo privileges in order to go out there and discover the MongoDB instances. Now finally, at the database level, Your MongoDB can either be configured with authentication or without authentication. And if it is configured for authentication, you will need to add this host manager and cluster manager roles in order to be able to do the data protection operations in MongoDB. Registration of the MongoDB application server is going to be a two-step process. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to give it the host address and the Spectrum Protect Plus user ID and password for the server. This is the user ID and password that has the passwordless sudo permissions. And then you'll start this mini discovery using this Get Instances button to get the MongoDB instances. Now, once you get the MongoDB instances, then for each one of those instances, you'll see you have to go in and do this Set Credentials button. And that is where you will go in and set the credentials that we talked about for the MongoDB if you indeed have that authentication set up. Once you do that, a full discovery will be run, and you will be able to pull in the full MongoDB instance information. After you do the inventory, you'll see either a standalone MongoDB instance, so here you see a standalone MongoDB instance, or you'll see a replica set with one of the members displayed with the replica set ID. You also see, in addition to that, the version of MongoDB that has been discovered. Just a note on MongoDBs, we are not going to go down to the single database level in MongoDB for this initial release. So the database is unlike the database granularity, unlike some of our other application modules, doesn't apply. So basically what you will see as a database name is this all. And another note from a log backup perspective, log backup is not going to be supported for MongoDB. So we will not be able to do point in time restore. Once you do that, you'll just apply an SLA like you do any other application. And when you're ready to do a restore, basically you can go out there and choose a restore point that you want, either pick the latest or pick a particular restore point, move it over to the right hand side, and choose your options to select the restore type and recovery mode for your MongoDB. You can do test, production, and instant access restores, and those kind of work just like any of the other databases. You can select a destination, either the original instance or an alternate instance. We do not support new database name at this time, but we do support restoring to a new destination path. We're not supporting logs at this time, so you're only going to have this recover until the end of backup option, and you'll also be able to overwrite the original MongoDB instance if you choose that overwrite option. When you start the restore, you just click restore and click yes, and the restore will begin. Now I put a video out here on a demo of backing up and restoring MongoDB. So if you're interested in seeing that demo, I would encourage you to take a look at that. We also support doing a test mode restore, which I already mentioned. It is only allowed to an alternate location or to an alternate instance, and the alternate instance must be running in order to do that. Okay, so that is MongoDB. Now we're going to move on to the next application in 10.1.3, which is Microsoft Exchange. So for Microsoft Exchange, here's some information about the prerequisites in terms of the supported platforms. We're going to support Exchange Server 2013, 2016, and 2019. And operating systems, Microsoft Windows Server 2012, 2016, and 2019. Now, again, I just said this with regard to MongoDB, but the same thing is true of all these applications. Really, the best course of action for any of these is to go out and Google Spectrum Protect Plus All Requirements documentation and look through the specific details of the prerequisites. It's going to give you information about the most current information about what's supported, what ports need to be open, what permissions need to be set up in the application for you in order to successfully run Spectrum Protect Plus and do a operation against that application. In terms of the details of Microsoft Exchange, adding an Exchange server is pretty much very similar to adding any other application in Spectrum Protect. Plus, you're going to give it the host address and the user ID and password with the proper permissions, and it will go out there and run a discovery against the Exchange server. It will look and find all the databases and mailboxes that are configured in that Exchange server, pass them back up to Spectrum Protect Plus, and then at that point you'll be able to go in and apply SLAs to that particular set of databases. Now, in terms of doing backup operations, data protection and the backup operations for Exchange are going to work pretty much like the rest of the applications in Spectrum Protect Plus, in that they're going to be incremental forever operations. The first backup will be a VSS full, and the entire EDB file will be moved from the Exchange server to Spectrum Protect Plus. And then all subsequent backups, we're only going to move the change blocks from the EDB files. You can optionally do log backups for Exchange, and that will allow you to do point-in-time restores for the Exchange server databases, and will only copy the transaction logs to the vSnap servers. Just like everything else, this is all specified in the SLAs. When you set up the SLAs, you'll set up a schedule for doing the backups, or you can demand them in. For restore operations for Exchange, there's a little bit of the usual and a little bit of the unusual, shall we say. The restore types in Exchange are your typical test, production, and instant access for database restores and full database restores. Test keeping the data on the vSnap repository for data reuse. Production doing a full restore. Instant access just mounting up the database. But in Microsoft Exchange, you're going to have this additional option for doing a granular restore. And we're going to talk about the details of doing a granular restore in Microsoft Exchange and how it works. But what a granular restore is going to allow you to do is do individual mailbox restore and individual message restore back to the Exchange server. If you are restoring the full database, you can restore it to the original instance or restore it to the alternate instance. You can also give it a new name, and you can also either run recovery, or if you back up the logs, do a point in time restoration. This is some details about the Exchange test restore. It spins up the database but leaves the data in the vSnap volume and creates an Exchange RDB from the mounted files. You can run it on an original instance or an alternate instance, and you can also restore the EDB and transaction log files and run recovery, or not run recovery and let the Exchange administrator do that work. For a production restore, it restores the database to the original location in the original instance, or to a new or alternate instance. You can, of course, change the name, and again, you can either have Spectrum Protect Plus run recovery for you, or run recovery yourself as the Exchange administrator, or do a point in time restore if you're backing up the logs. Now, for granular restores in Exchange, this is what is a little different for Exchange, because in all of our other applications, we do not go down to this level. For all of our other applications supported by Spectrum Protect Plus, the lowest level we're going to go to is the database level. But with this granular restore option in Exchange, it's going to allow you to restore individual mailboxes or individual mailbox items, or restore to a PST file. Now, the difference in the way this works is when you do a granular restore, it is going to be a two-step or two-part operation. Part one that you're going to run from the Spectrum Protect Plus server is going to make the backup available to the Exchange server where the restore operation will occur. And then on the Exchange server, what you're going to do is use the MMC GUI that we essentially rebranded from the data protection for Exchange for Spectrum Protect, and go in and do either the mailbox restore or the individual item restore. Now, one of the things I do want to point out here is that this particular MMC does not need to be installed by the user on the Exchange server or on an alternate server. As part of Spectrum Protect Plus's agentless design, this MMC GUI is going to be pushed down to the Exchange server and allow you to run the mailbox restore from that server. This slide kind of talks about how things will look from the Spectrum Protect Plus server. As you can see, the very first granular restore is going to do that agentless push of the MMC GUI to the Spectrum Protect, to the Exchange server, and then you'll see an information message on the Spectrum Protect Plus server that tells you need to connect to the Exchange application server to do your mailbox or your mail message restore. Now, just a few considerations for doing individual message restore on Exchange servers. You do have to use as a sort, or install as a prerequisite, Microsoft Outlook on the Exchange server 2016 or 2019 to support granular restores. Microsoft has kind of gone back and forth on whether there is the recommendation to install Outlook, but on their Exchange servers. If you choose not to do this, you can run the granular restore from any server in the enterprise and just do the granular restore and run the MMC from there. And there's some information in that README text that describes the process of how to do this. Now, one of the things we haven't talked about yet, and I wanted to kind of group together for Exchange, is just like Microsoft SQL Server supports AAGs, uh, Microsoft Exchange does high availability with a so-called DAG, or Database Availability Group. With the Database Availability Group, the mailbox databases are going to be spread across several different servers. And you're going to have active databases on some servers, and the rest of the databases are going to be passive mailbox database copies. If you are backing up a DAG with Spectrum Protect Plus, we do support it. You should go out and register all the servers in the DAG, all of the Exchange servers. So in this picture, it would be Exchange 1 through 5 with Spectrum Protect Plus. When you go to do the backup, we will support two different views for DAGs. There is a standalone view where you can see the standalone databases, and also this DAG view, or Database Availability Group view, where you can see the DAGs in Microsoft Exchange. And this is the screen where you will go in and apply the SLAs and set the various options for backup. For Exchange backups with a DAG, uh, you can go in and specify which particular node in the database availability group you want to perform the backups on. So here you see a picture of the option screen for a DAG backup, and you can go in and do this selection where you set the preferred node. And if you want to, for perhaps node balancing purposes, back up, say, DB1 from Exchange Server 2, then you can do that in the backup options panel. In a DAG configuration, as far as restore goes, Spectrum Protect Plus will restore back to the same instance that the backup was taking from. And by default, if you don't override it in that previous screen, backup is taken on the node the database is active on. If you did go in and change the preferred node on that previous screen to a passive node, then at restore time, the user must either make the passive node the active node or use the restore to alternate instance option to restore back to the active node. So we've talked about S3 optimized offload, we've talked about MongoDB, we've talked about ExchangeDB. Now we're going to go into the GUI and usability enhancements in Spectrum Protect Plus 10.1.3. So basically we continue to add features to Spectrum Protect Plus, and the user interface continues to evolve, and we continue to add more functionality to the user interface. We've now enhanced the jobs and operations section to where there are 3 tabs on it as opposed to 1. Basically, it makes it easy to find the running jobs in the job history. This policy and job list tab is going to be pretty much the same as what you're used to using in version 10.1.2. Running jobs shows the jobs that are currently running. And you can filter by backup, restore, inventory, or maintenance. This is a view of the left-hand side of that, so it contains a quick preview of all the running jobs and their statuses. And you can, of course, change the sort order or filter out the specific jobs that you want to see. The right-hand side of the running job list gives the log details. So you can now see what is in the logs, or you can always see what's in the logs, but now you can do this quick drill down from the running jobs to the logs. And you can also download a zip file that contains the logs in the zip file if you want to do some offline analysis. The job history tab is the second tab. This is the same design as the running jobs tab, but it shows all of the job history. And as you can see, you can also filter on failed, warning, or successful jobs and pick a history period. We've also added now the ability, and particularly dealing with the cloud, the ability to store keys and certificates in the main GUI. There are two types of key-based authentication supported: access key and SSH key. The access key authentication is going to be similar to the username and password, and really it's primarily used to authenticate with cloud system endpoints. So the cloud providers are going to grant an access key as well as a secret access key when accessing those cloud providers. We also allow the ability to store SSH keys, and they are primarily used for authentication with application servers, including Oracle, DB2, and Mongo. And you just saw an example of the Mongo key that is used to authenticate with the MongoDB application. You can also use these for authentication for file level indexing for Linux and AIX VMs on VMware on Hyper-V. Now, from an ad hoc backup perspective, you always could do ad hoc backups from Spectrum Protect Plus, but the ad hoc backups were done on an entire SLA. So basically, you had to run the entire SLA to do an online backup. Now, there is a desire to be able to run one machine, so maybe you just set up a machine and want to test it out. So now you have the option to do an on-demand backup of a single VM or database in the SLA policy. Basically, the way this is done is you select the machine and you click this Run button. The ad hoc session will create a new session ID. And just as an FYI, only the backup jobs are supported, not replication and offload jobs. You can also only back up at this time a single VM or database is allowed from the individual backup, so you can't select multiple machines. And the options that are used for that particular backup will be the ones you saved in the UI when you did the latest options update. Again, another issue with kind of the granularity that people wanted was people wanted to, if a SLA failed, to be able to rerun just the failed machines of the SLA, not the whole SLA. And beginning in 10.1.3, you can now do that. If an SLA policy has multiple objects and a job has a partial failure, you can now rerun the jobs for the objects that failed. And basically what's going to happen is it's going to use the same session ID of the original job, and if the rerun job is successful, it will be updated in the job summary. Just an FYI, the overall job time is determined by the start time of the first backup and the completion of the rerun. So obviously, if the job sat around for a long time, it may have a long runtime. That won't indicate that it actually ran for that time, but that's how long it took for the operation to complete. This is an example of how you do it. So here we are looking at the job log for Hyper-V, and you now have this rerun button that you can select. As I mentioned, it's only available for backup jobs, and it's only available for the latest partial backup session, so you can't go back more than one day, and the latest SLA options will be followed. You can't rerun file level indexing, only a failed jobs. And there's a couple other options that you can't rerun: snapshot condensed fails on a storage system, job partial due to an unknown failure or maybe a cataloging error, and the job where the resource is not present. We've added a new feature for VM backup prioritization. In a lot of cases, if you have a lot of VMs in your environment, you may want to prioritize some so that those particular VMs run first in the backup sequence and the others have a low priority. And now you can denote that. There's a new option for the VM to set its priority, and VMs with the higher priority will be backed up first in the job. When you set the priority, the default is going to be 5, 1 is the most important, and 10 is the least important. Here's where you set the backup priority in the options. Here you can see the default is set to 5, and you can, of course, change that. Again, the granularity level of metadata expiration. In previous versions of the product, you could expire a particular SLA and the data associated with it. But if you did that, you expired all the VMs associated with that particular SLA. There are certain cases where you obviously didn't want to do that. You might want to only expire some of the VMs associated with a particular SLA or a particular run of a SLA. And SPP will now allow you to expire the metadata from the catalog of a single object. And you can do that with a database or a VM. And previous versions of SPP and that will essentially remove that run object. Okay, moving on to 10.1.3 vSnap and infrastructure enhancements. We had a lot of requests. You could, in 10.1.2, of course, protect the Spectrum Protect Plus catalog. You can offload it to a separate vSnap. But a lot of the requests that we got were along the lines of, well, I don't want to have to rebuild my Spectrum Protect Plus server if I lose my primary site. And beginning in version 10.1.3, we now support using high availability for the Spectrum Protect Plus server. So we did some testing and made some minor code changes, and we now support using VMware high availability mode for the Spectrum Protect Plus server. In case of a failure, VMware will automatically fail over to the other Spectrum Protect or to the other VMware server and in an active passive configuration and essentially keep your Spectrum Protect Plus server up and running. There's a very good tech note that's referenced here. I would encourage you to read that tech note for how it's supported in VMware. And also keep in mind that you still, even though you have high availability on the Spectrum Protect Plus server, you still want to have a catalog backup available just in case. Just like on VMware, Hyper-V has a fault tolerance high availability configuration, and Spectrum Protect Plus will now support running your Spectrum Protect Plus server in this fault tolerance HA configuration. And again, same caveats. See the tech note for the details of how it's configured and still have a catalog backup. From a vSnap, a VADP proxy perspective, we now have the ability to deploy a combined VADP proxy with vSnap. And basically you will have this option when you either deploy in VMware or Hyper-V. Basically you will, we included the VADP proxy service in the OVA. That is the vSnap. And when you deploy the vSnap, you will provide the SPP IP address during the deployment of the OVA. And when that happens, the discovery service running on SPP, on Spectrum Protect Plus, will then add the vSnap server as a VADP proxy. That same configuration is supported on Hyper-V when you have a combined vSnap with vSnap running on Hyper-V with VADP proxy. Except post-deployment, you need to run the script on the on the vSnap appliance. This update underscore vadp.sh set-ip-address script. And you can of course do this too on VMware if you wanted to set it after the deployment of the OVA. We have had requests to be able to throttle vSnap replication and offload. Some people might not want to take up all the bandwidth for vSnap replication or offload. So beginning in version 10.1.3, you're given the ability to throttle at the UI level replication and offload jobs. And basically you'll be able to control how many jobs are active against a particular vSnap to adjust the throttle. We do have a nice schedule in the UI which looks like that. And basically you can go in and enable throttling, set the rate, and set the particular days and times that you want the site to be throttled. Beginning in version 10.1.3, we now support Open LDAP. We previously support Active Directory as a repository for usernames, and now we support added support for Open LDAP. And basically the configuration is very similar to the way we used to support Active Directory, or still do support Active Directory. Okay, continuing with version 10.1.3, REST API enhancements. This is a really neat feature that I like. In previous versions, Spectrum Protect Plus, of course, is REST API driven since it's a modern application. And we always provided PDF documentation for the REST API so that you could go in there and write your own scripts. But beginning in version 10.1.3, we are now delivering the REST API documentation as in the Swagger application. And on the right, you'll see a kind of a screenshot of what things look like. If you now go in the application and click on the API documentation link, you will see all of the REST APIs listed, grouped by category, as you see cut and pasted in the middle here. And here you'll see all of the particular APIs, REST API methods that are available, and you can go in there and click on any one of those and see the documentation. Now what's really neat about this, in addition to providing the documentation grouped like this and outside of a PDF, is the REST API is live against the Spectrum Protect Plus server. So what you can do is, if you click on any one of these REST API endpoints, you can test it live against the Spectrum Protect Plus server. So basically you can see all the parameters that are necessary, make a call against the Spectrum Protect Plus server, and see what the return is going to look like. So it makes it very easy to see what these endpoints do and test the returns without having to go out and use a separate tool like Postman or curl on Unix or some other REST programming, or some other programming language essentially that you're going to use to make the REST call. Beginning in 10.1.3, we've also added a new analytics API to Spectrum Protect Plus. We always could return reporting data from Spectrum Protect Plus, but it was kind of cumbersome in the REST API in that you had to create a report task, poll the task, and then parse the data once the report was finished. And beginning in version 10.1.3, we've now introduced this analytics API, which makes things much easier for reporting and alerting, querying the Spectrum Protect server, Spectrum Protect Plus server. Here are some of the new GET endpoints that are available in Spectrum Protect Plus now. DB backup history, VM backup history, DB backups compliance, and SLA compliance for the particular VM. So it's the typical information you'd want to be able to easily pull from the Spectrum Protect server plus server about the backup history and the SLA compliance. Okay, that completes 10.1.3, the differences. As you can see, there were a lot of features and functionality added at version 10.1.3. I hope you found this information useful. I hope you didn't find it too long. But in any event, I look forward to seeing you in a future video.